This is Colonel Towner-Watkins and War Hamster Brady. We are going to continue our series on secret societies, and I'm going to let War Hamster Brady tell us what we're going to cover today.
Okay, well, first of all, Happy New Year to everybody. 2025 is already starting out a little bit more exciting than I expected. Those events yesterday were, I don't know, the news cycle is going full speed. Let's put it bluntly. Did you read that both of the bombers yesterday were from the same Army base?
Well, they served at least one tour at the same Army base, and I believe that Army base is Fort Bragg.
Okay. Well, that story is going to be developing for a while. We'll give it a 48-hour rule, but
yeah, it is. But Fort Bragg, anybody that's been following the Operation Gladio series knows that base comes up a lot. That and Fort Benning, both of those two bases is the CIA's hunting ground and training ground for Gladio cells all over the world.
Yeah. So yeah, with this, we'll be keeping an eye on that one closely. You know, if we have to do a quick sit rep or something like that, I'll jump on with you. I just, hope it stops it too. I don't know. They canceled one of the football games yesterday in New Orleans.
Sugar Bowl.
Yeah, and it's being replayed today. But apparently, the story was they found 2 other IEDs near the stadium. So I don't know. If we start getting talking about
there was a fire in the guy's Airbnb where he was staying.
Interesting.
They rented their vehicles from the same app.
Yeah. And Elon had to clarify this was not a battery explosion. This was a bomb explosion. So
yes,
there you have that. Today, we're going to go deeper into Skull and Bones. We'll go through some of the prominent members from the 1800s and how and really what I'm going to try to continue to do today is just show the connections. Our overarching theme has been to look at this objectively and say, okay, Skull and Bones is a secret society, and these people have been connected throughout their post-college careers and set in some very prestigious positions of power. So the question outstanding is, is this because they've got, are they scheming together to rule the world and install their new world order? Or is it just rich people have a tendency to hang out with rich people and network with people they went to college with, and it's that innocent? So far, last week we did the Bushes, all the coincidences and positions of power and all the people around them. It suggests the former, not the latter. But again, we'll let our audience draw their own conclusions. I brought up a YouTube video from a gentleman who seems to have done his homework pretty well, draws slightly different conclusions to what I'm angling at. But I think it's fair to hear the counter case and play a few minutes of that. Stop me whenever you want. And so I will pull that up right here. And I should have it at the right mark.
In conspiracy lore around Skull and Bones. According to the author page for Anthony, Sutton was a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University from 1968 to 1973. He was a former economics professor at California State University, Los Angeles. He was born in London in 1925, educated at the Universities of London, Göttingen, and California.
So he's talking about Anthony T. Sutton, who wrote really one of the best books on Skull and Bones. And he's going to give him a critique right here, which I think is fair.
California with a doctorate of science degree from the University of Southampton, England, and passed away in Reno, Nevada in 2002. And the book he wrote is wordy and fucking boring. Holy shit. I'll summarize the key points as best I can. He says that the U.S. Council of Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan member organization, a think tank specialized in U.S. foreign policy and international relations, founded in 1922 or 1921, a very influential think tank, has had a lot of former Skull and Bones dudes as members, and it has. Had even more Bonesmen as, has even more non-Bonesmen members, but does have a number of Bonesmen. And the CFR has provided the CIA with a ton of classified policy recommendations over the years. Many government officials are members. And he points out that during the Eisenhower administration, 40% of the top U.S. foreign policy officials were CFR members. Eisenhower himself had been a council member. Under Truman, 42% of the top posts were filled by council members. During the Kennedy administration, this number rose to 51%, peaked at 57% under the Johnson administration. But again,
Remember who founded the CFR?
Rockefeller.
You got it.
Not all of those CFR people were Bonesmen. Like, not even close. He doesn't really ever hit that note. He'll just say, like, well, this organization has a lot of Bonesmen, and then look at what this organization has done. Well, yeah, it might have like 5% Bonesmen. And like, so the argument doesn't make sense when you actually present the percentages. The Rockefeller Foundation has funded numerous CFR studies. There have been numerous Bonesmen in the Rockefeller Foundation, but again, more members have not been. The CFR has two types of membership.
Can you pause
life
that for
membership and term?
So if I just want to point out a fallacy in what he's saying. So if you look at people, college graduates, let's even narrow it down to that. What percentage are Bonesmen? And his thing is that even if it's like 5%, well, that's not a big percent. Well, if they only make up 0.01% of the entire population, 5% is a shit ton of them. So
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, and population-wise, it's even smaller than that. You're talking about 15.
No, I know, but that's my point.
Yeah, yeah.
He is doing what he's accusing Anthony Sutton of doing. I just wanted to point that out. Go ahead.
Oh, no, and that's good. What I was going to say is, we pointed this out a couple episodes ago. One of the things they do is they're usually the founders of new institutions and agencies, et cetera. They set that. You'll find a Bonesman at the very onset of a lot of these organizations. They set this tone for an entire organization when they get there first.
Yes.
Term membership, which lasts for 5 years. The first one, the term membership is 5 years, available only to those between the ages of 30 and 36. There are over 5,000 members currently, and no mention of exactly how many current members are Bonesmen. Anthony Sutton asserted that within the CFR is a secret group that controls it. By controlling the CFR, it actually controls U.S. foreign policy. That policy is heading to a one world government, Illuminati, deep state, new world order situation. And this talk has been going on for decades. That secret group is supposedly known as the Order. Who composes the Order? The Skull and Bones. So the Skull and Bones controls world foreign policy. Boom. They are the new Illuminati. They have already secretly taken over the world. How exactly does he know that? Well, Sutton doesn't know that. He provides zero proof of that. Writes a lot of words, stretches a lot.
All right, you get the general gist of that, his opinion on this. And having read Sutton's work, I think he does make a pretty good case. But it's not like these guys leave smoking gun evidence trails everywhere they go. That's what we're doing is we're trying to connect dots and see if there's patterns.
Correct.
I'd suggest we do. So let's jump into some Bonesmen, unless you want to make any more comment about that.
No, I'm good.
Okay. What we decided to do is just kind of go down chronologically from the list of Skull and Bones members and to see who's, some of the more distinguished ones. And, do they fit these patterns of, these blue blood families always intermarrying, always putting themselves in these positions, bottleneck positions all over the place to actually run American foreign policy. And I think this bears repeating, we both made the case. American foreign policy it's never been Republican or Democrat. They don't care who's in office. The foreign policy never changes, especially since World War II. But I'm going to suggest right here, it goes back even further than that. The people that are actually navigating the ship of the United States internationally is from a very small group of families, a lot of them Skull and Bones. So that's reasonable thesis?
Yes.
First one I want to start with, I may as well pull up a picture. Give me 1 second. We'll talk about William M. Evarts, Evarts. And I'll give you a picture of him real quick. And here is Mr. Evarts. He was born in 1818 and died in 1901. And where's my stop share? There we go. Okay, so what do we know about him? He's a Bonesman, class of 1837, so one of the initial ones. He was a U.S. Senator from New York. He was the U.S. Secretary of State from 1877 to 81 under both Hayes and Garfield. He was a U.S. Attorney in 1868 and 69 under Johnson. Interesting background. We've mentioned this name before, but he is the grandson of Roger Sherman. Who's Roger Sherman? He's one of the founding fathers. He's the guy who basically is given credit for founding Connecticut, and is the only person to sign all four of the founding documents: the Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. That's Roger Sherman, and this is one of his it's his grandson. It's Evarts. So he goes to Yale, becomes Bonesman. What did he do in his career? Well, later on, he represented the estate of the Astor family, John Jacob Astor. He was an attorney. He represented them, so quite a bit of money. He was always a Whig, and he was not an abolitionist. He defended Douglas's Compromise of 1850. I found one of the interesting things that he did was he ran against Horace Greeley for the Senate in 1861, and neither one of them won. You remember Horace Greeley?
I do.
That's a famous Lincoln wrote a famous letter to Horace Greeley where he talked about, I care not if we end slavery or not. I just want the Union. That's the famous letter to Horace Greeley. So if anybody ever wants to have a conversation, was a Civil War fought over slavery? In Lincoln's own words, it clearly was not. And that's where you find the best evidence is the letters to Horace Greeley that Lincoln wrote. So that was a fun little coincidence there. What else we have on him? Yes. He is the one who prosecuted the prize cases or litigated the prize cases. You familiar?
No.
All right. So the background is Lincoln wouldn't declare war on the Confederacy because it would be recognizing the Confederacy as a nation. So instead of declaring war, he just put up a naval blockade. Since the South had no almost no manufacturing of its own, they relied on imports and exports from Europe. The blockade was pretty darn effective. So it gets interesting. In admiralty law, when you capture ships during war, you can keep them as a prize. But because Lincoln wouldn't declare war, the Southern ships and the British ships couldn't be kept as prizes. Well, that got litigated and ended up the North got to keep them. They kind of twisted the law to a great degree. That's Mr. Evarts. It's a very storied career. There's a little bit more about this. He's one of the lawyers that tried to prosecute Jefferson Davis for treason after the war. Now, this is why they wrote the 14th Amendment. And this is a big part of it. What's interesting is Jefferson Davis never, ever went to trial for treason. They didn't want to litigate whether the South had legally seceded. And therefore, because it would have come out in court that Lincoln had no legal basis to invade. At least that was the fear. So nobody was ever tried for treason. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was not. But this is one of the lawyers. Mr. Evarts is one of the lawyers that tried to get him on there.
Because the thought process is that states had the right to succeed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And they did not want to recognize that at all.
No, it's 100%. It's interesting. The Articles of Confederation had the words perpetual union in it, and that did not survive the rewriting of the Constitution. The Constitution never would have been ratified if states thought it was the Hotel California, that you could check in, but you can never leave. In fact, a lot of northern states tried to secede in 1814 to the middle of the War of 1812. There's something called the some big conference in Massachusetts where they several northern states almost seceded and joined Canada. They didn't like the War of 1812 because they were dependent. The northern colonies or northern states were much more dependent on trade with the British, so they didn't want any part of it.
Well, and that kind of flipped throughout that century because in the late 1800s, around the time we're talking, the cotton industry, the rice industry had blossomed in the South, and England was one of the primary purchasers of the cotton because they were shipping it over to India, which was a colony, and manufacturing using that cotton because they loved the South's cotton that created material that was then used in Britain. They manufactured clothing and everything in India that was then sold to Britain, which is why you find the British and the French helping the South, where Russia kind of cut them off on both coasts from interfering in the Civil War because they definitely wanted the South to win.
Yeah. Well, tariffs that the tariff of abominations was it's a tax on exporters as well as importers, because the South, if we're putting a tariff on European goods, they're going to slap one on Southern goods. So the tariff of abominations was the South fought against, but Europe didn't like it either. Funny you bring up cotton, because the next family we talk about as the whole cotton industry has a huge skull and bones connection, which we'll get into. So it's funny you bring that up. The last reason, go figure, right? Last reason that secession was considered legal. In 1860, 3 times Congress unsuccessfully tried to pass a bill making secession illegal. So if it wasn't legal, why would you try to pass a bill that makes it illegal?
And wouldn't that have had a lot to do with the fact that the senators worked for the governor and the state legislature the way it's supposed to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And now the states have lost that protection.
17th Amendment. And we did a great video on that a while back, why the 17th needs to be repealed. And with it, Reynolds v. Sims. But let's not go down that rabbit hole today. If you're on my channel, look for those videos. You'll enjoy them. Getting back to Mr. Evarts. Where was I? He was the counsel for Andrew Johnson during his impeachment trial, first impeachment of a president. He's the guy who defended Andrew Johnson. Why did they impeach Andrew Johnson? Lincoln named him as a running mate because he was a Democrat, and Lincoln was a Republican. He was trying to get a unity ticket. So when Lincoln's assassinated, all of a sudden you've got a Democrat president, and you've got a dominant right-wing Republican House and Senate. And Johnson was just vetoing everything they threw at him. So eventually they tried to impeach him for vetoing all this stuff. So fascinating little story. When he's a senator, he's the guy who was a sponsor of the Judiciary Act of 1891. Why does this matter? Well, that's how we created the U.S. Courts of Appeals. So huge expansion of the courts under this guy's bill. He's got a son named Allen Wardner Evarts, who graduated Yale in 1869. He was not a member of Skull and Bones because he was one of the co-founders of the Wolf's Head Society. Want that repeated?
No.
Yeah, we talked about the big 3 secret societies of Yale. You've got Skull and Bones, Scroll and Pen.
Scroll and Pen.
And then, of course, Wolf's Head, which seems to be one of the most secretive because we don't know all. I don't have good lists of their members. One of our followers, one of your followers, or whoever watching this, sent me a pretty good link on that, but it's not anywhere as near complete as we have on Skull and Bones. His other son was a guy by the name of Maxwell Evarts. He was Skull and Bones 1884. He's interesting because he was a district attorney for New York. He was also the general counsel for a railroad guy by the name of E.H. Harriman, who we know was working side by side with the Bushes for years. Maxwell Evarts also really, really famous for another case that he represented, and that's called the Wong Kim Ark case. Are you familiar with that one? Chinese guy born in America was suing to get American citizenship, and he wanted basically the courts have interpreted this as that's how we got birthright citizenship, was because of Wong Kim Ark. It's a case from 1890 something. Yeah, right around there. But that's where we got birthright citizenship. This was a Skull and Bones alumni named Maxwell Evarts, is the guy who represented the plaintiff in that. So pretty interesting family, huh?
That's crazy. I also noticed that his father-in-law, Allen Wardner, he's kind of interesting too. Where did I find that? He was one of the original guys that advocated for Liberia and setting up that colony in Liberia to repatriate the Africans back to Africa.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that?
What I have, no, I don't have that part. What I have, he was just a Vermont state treasurer, Allen Wardner. I didn't have the stuff that you just brought up.
Yeah, he was a member of the American Colonialization Society that was a shock to me. I found that when we were doing Angola, because, of course, Reagan got us into Angola. And then I started looking around Africa, and I'm like, I've never really done much research on Algeria. And I started looking, or Liberia, sorry. I started looking into that, and I'm like, what the hell? Why don't I know this? Yeah. So from like 1820 till the mid 50s, and he was in 1850s in that general time frame, there was an entire movement in the United States that wanted to send all the Africans back to Africa. And there wasn't any like one place where they could send them. So they basically went over there, took their own space, and created they took basically the whole country, but they took this entire group of people and resettled them, blacks, over to Africa. But then you know what happened there? All of the blacks that had lived in America enslaved the indigenous population there and made them all work for them as slaves. So just a fun little tidbit.
Here's a fun little blurb on him as well. He became a Whig after the anti-Masonic party dissolved, and they joined the group. Yeah. So he was part of something called the anti-Masonic, anti-Freemasons.
Shocker.
It's fun stuff. Okay, I think that's about all I have on him. But once again, you see how these founding families really stick together, and they have some they're placed in amazingly prominent roles. And I thought that's a really good example.
Yeah.
All right. We cannot talk about Skull and Bones without talking about the Whitney family. I have brought them up before. They should be far more famous than they are. Because this is probably the...
hold on. Sorry. Yeah, never mind. Go ahead.
Right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The Whitney family is probably the most prestigious family in American history. And nobody talks about them. I have no idea how they've been able to stay under the radar. One of the most famous Whitneys, of course, is Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin, which is what you alluded to with the Civil War. When the cotton gin was invented, it made it so they could pick cotton about 50 times, or process cotton 50 times faster, created a huge demand for slavery in the South, and led directly, obviously, to many other things that happened since then. That's the Whitney family, but they go back a long ways. Let me give you a quick look at the one I'm going to focus on here is William Collins Whitney, but he is not alone. And this is William Collins Whitney. Good looking guy. Looks like he's wearing some monocles or something. So let's talk about William Collins. Born 1841, lived till 1904. So 63 years of a good life, I suppose. And what's so special about him? He is a Skull and Bones member from 1863. He was known as a political leader and a financier. Ran a lot of the Whitney family businesses. Well, since nobody really knows who the Whitneys are, they probably do know who the businesses are. Anyone on Wall Street knows who J.H. Whitney and Company is. It's their big leveraged buyout company, very prominent in the 80s. But they've been a private bank and I guess venture capital type firm for a very long time. That's I believe founded by one of his brothers. Other Whitney family businesses: Freeport McMoran. How about Minute Maid orange juice, who they would eventually sell to Coca-Cola? And of course, the Whitney families were the original owners of Pan American Airlines.
Oh, so they're into the CIA.
You think? I knew you were going to like that one. For the audience, tell if people who haven't heard you before, talk about Pan Am and the connection to the CIA, if you would.
Well, obviously, a lot of the different back during the Flying Tigers and the World War II era, you have the infiltration of many of the airlines because they have to use them to transport their ill-gotten goods along with shipping companies. And Pan Am was one of the original purveyors of support for the opium trafficking at large. And because of the difficulty in bridging both a civilian and a covert aspect of a particular airline, they opted, after using Pan Am for a very long time, they opted to create their own civil air transport, CAT, Air America, and all of the things that came after that, Evergreen, just to name a few of them. But they were all modeled exclusively off of the covert side of Pan Am.
Excellent. And this is the Whitney family that founded that. You have to make the assumption they kind of knew what was going on.
I would make the assumption they definitely knew what was going on.
Yeah, I think it's pretty fair. So let's talk more about the Whitney family before I get more into William Collins Whitney. He's descended from a guy by the name of John Whitney of London, who was one of the earliest settlers. Settled in Watertown, Massachusetts in 1635. His father was Brigadier General James Scalay Whitney. Let's talk about what he did in the Navy. What was his position? He was the Secretary of the Navy. And it's the time he did it, which is interesting, was March of 1885 to March of 1889. This is the guy who ushered in the steel steamships, the modern naval guns, and domestic manufacture of plate armor. I bring this up because the very first U.S. intelligence agency was founded just a few years earlier than that. The Office of Naval Intelligence, the ONI, was founded in the 1870s. The excuse for founding the Office of Naval Intelligence is American Navy was concerned that the Europeans were creating what they called a weapon of mass destruction. You and I would probably call it a battleship today. So this guy, after we create the ONI, somehow get the plans for what battleships are all about, this guy steps in as the Secretary of the Navy and basically remakes our entire fleet. So interesting.
Well, and it also is interesting because it's shortly after his stint as the Secretary of Navy with all of these wonderful new toys that we began our long overthrowing. Because within 2 years of him leaving office as the Secretary of Navy in charge of naval intelligence, we cooed the Queen in Hawaii. So he's going to make, and a few years after that, we take over Panama. He's going to make use, and of course, then they benefit, right? Because they own all of these businesses eventually. So that's why I'm saying I don't think at any time that you can separate anything that looks like they're perpetuating this covert entree into other markets. They don't get the benefit of the doubt.
No, they don't. And it's really funny you bring up both Hawaii and Panama and others. Before we're done today, I'll show you some more skull and bones connections to all of those endeavors because it's deep. They're all over the place. Interestingly enough, while he's the Secretary of the Navy, his brother, a guy named Henry Melville Whitney, not a Bonesman, happened to be the president of a company called Metropolitan Steamship Company, and then he was the founder of Dominion Iron and Steel Company. Guess who got the contracts to build the Navy ships?
Dominion?
That's interesting. All right, here's it gets fun. He's got a sister named Susan Collins Whitney. She's obviously not a Bonesman, but she married a guy by the name of Henry F. Dimmock, who is a Bonesman from 1863. So keep it in the family, right?
Right. Susan Collins, huh? That name rings a bell.
Oh, think they got any relation to the senator?
Who knows?
Yeah, you may want to look into that.
They love naming rights like that. It's crazy.
Yeah, and we see it throughout this story that we're telling. It's the mother's maiden name becomes the middle name, and it goes down through generations. So Dimmock made a little bit of a name on his own. He worked for the Metro Steamship and Dominion Steel, as well as other Whitney family businesses. They named a 2,625-ton steamship, called it the H.F. Dimmock, after him. So the family liked him a lot. The steamship Dimmock would end up colliding and sinking the yacht of one William Vanderbilt.
What?
Can't make that stuff up. And they actually fought it. They actually went to court over that, and I think the captain of the Dimmock got off, wasn't held accountable. Don't think Vanderbilt was happy about that. Dimmock would go on to become the director of the Yale Corporation. So,
oh my gosh!
I wish I could stop there, but let's go. Okay, let's talk about the other Whitneys in Skull and Bones. They are all over the rolls. We had Eli Whitney Blake Jr., was a Bonesman from 1857. He's the grandnephew of Eli Whitney, the cotton gin guy. We had Edward Baldwin Whitney, Bonesman, 1878, who was a New York Supreme Court justice.
That's probably how the Vanderbilts didn't get any justice.
Well, here's where it gets interesting. We've got a Harry Payne Whitney, Bonesman, 1894. He married a woman by the name of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. So who knows? His sister was a Pauline Payne Whitney. She marries the first Baron of Queenborough, England, guy by the name of Hugh Paget, or however you say it. And this is where the Whitneys got really into horse racing. Harry Payne Whitney spent a lot of his time and money racing thoroughbreds. He had multiple Kentucky Derby winners, and he got elected or named into the Racing Hall of Fame in 2018. So, Whitney family.
One of the things that I have figured out is the vice that they choose, and horse racing being one of them, gambling, prostitution, whatever. And they all seem to have a vice. Like all of the original hotel barons used their hotels originally as prostitution houses. And so, and this goes way back. So what I have found very interesting is the horse race venues were always ran by the mafia. And that's where these very wealthy families, the original Operation Gladio assassins and paramilitary, were the mafia. And this is where they were allowed to meet in relative privacy, because you have very wealthy people with horses and the mafia running the horse tracks. So they come together, they plan their events under the guise of being at the track, and then they part their ways, and there's not a lot of anyone ever looking under the hood of that relationship. But a lot of if you start, because obviously I did a lot of research into the mafia and how they were working back pre-World War II, when the Lucky Luciano and stuff like that. And all the time, this racetrack, it keeps getting brought up, the racetrack. And then you start looking at the racetrack owners and you're like, well, those are the corporate titans. And that's where they were meeting and arranging the Gladio operations before we had things like NATO.
So did you ever make a connection with the mafia and Bing Crosby?
I came across him and Frank Sinatra a bunch down in Cuba.
Interesting. So I spent a lot of time at the Del Mar racetrack in San Diego. My family lived in Del Mar, and I actually even worked one summer as a bartender and a waiter at the Del Mar Turf Club, which is where all the muckety mucks had these meetings you're talking about.
Yes.
A lot of things at the Del Mar racetrack are named after Bing Crosby. He's one of the founders of the track. I'm not going to say I have any firsthand knowledge of what you're talking about with racetracks, but I am smart enough to put two and two together. And the race culture is very, very unique in and of itself. And Del Mar is a huge, during this track season, the whole town is transformed into, you get a whole new group of people that comes into town every year. So I think that what you're saying about racetrack matches my observation.
Well, and when you go and start looking back at their efforts to move the gamblings onto Indian reservations where the U.S. has no jurisdiction, it goes right along with that whole thought process Yeah. I mean, but it's true. It's crazy the links that it's been going on right in front of us, and we never put two and two together.
Well, those Indian casinos in California are the second biggest lobbyist in the state. They basically are kingmakers in California politics. I happen to know the lawyer.
Yeah.
I happen to know the lawyer who represents a bunch of those casinos in Southern California, and he's a libertarian, good guy. That's where I met him in Libertarian Party politics way back when. But yeah, and he can't tell me too many secrets of what goes on there. But if you pay attention to California politics, the Indian casinos, and some of the Indian tribes don't have gaming, and they've got no political power at all. But there's a lot of money filters from the casinos to Sacramento.
Yes, and that's why they love it. It's a kickback scheme.
What isn't?
All right.
Let's go to William Payne Whitney.
Okay.
Skull and Bones, 1898. So that's four or five so far. I think that's five. He's a big investor in banking. You've heard of Citibank of New York, also now today known as Citibank.
The money launderers? Yeah.
My former employer. Yeah, that one. He was a big investor there, practically the founder. He was a big tobacco investor. He was in railroads, mining, oil, and I think he was the founder of the Great Northern Paper Company, which would end up being acquired by Georgia Pacific in 1990. But that's William Payne Whitney, very successful investor. Here's where it gets fun. He married a woman named Helen Julia Hay. And who's Helen Julia Hay? Well, her father was a guy by the name of John Hay, who just happened to be the U.S. Secretary of State from 1898 to 1905.
Yeah, he came up in the Panama.
Yeah, exactly. What happened in 1898, the Spanish-American War, and when we took over Hawaii.
So, and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba.
Yeah, well, that's gonna come
all
back
under
again.
Him.
What's that part come back again in the story today? Which is amazing, all these connections. I mean, we have a Bonesman that marries into the Secretary of State while this stuff is going on. Come on, you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, and just so that everybody understands, when the Spanish had the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico as colonies, there had been wars, internal freedom battles fought for decades under the occupation of the Spanish in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. When the U.S. entered the war, they thought the U.S. was coming to save them. And in turn, we occupied them. And we were more vicious than the Spanish had ever been in defeating the nationalists that wanted their freedom. And those people were very bitter after that about the United States in general, because they basically went in, especially in the Philippines. It was vicious what we did to the people there.
I'm just reading the chat there. Some good comments. One last connection with the Whitneys. So remember last week I talked about George Herbert Walker Jr. was the co-founder of the New York Mets. The person who wrote the biggest check was a woman by the name of Joan Whitney Payson, who was the daughter of William Payne Whitney. So once again, it circles back to the Bushes and Walkers.
Yep. Bonesmen all behind it.
Yeah, let's go back to that opening video we played. Do you think maybe there's more connections than he's, giving us credit for?
Well, and again, if you cannot make a substance argument on a quantity basis. If the one bonesman in an organization is the guy in charge, who gives a crap if you have 1 or 50? If he's the guy in charge that is doing everything and what they're doing is bad, you know what I'm saying? His entire substantive argument was quantity. Quantity doesn't matter. We've got over 1 million people, a couple million in the military. if you have 1% of them that are evil and they all happen to be general officers, does it really matter what the rest of it is? No, you can't make a substantive argument about the impact that Bonesmen have based on numbers. That's a ridiculous argument.
No, I think you hammered that home pretty good. I'm in full agreement with you. But we're making the argument, so make it fair. Let everyone judge for themselves.
Yeah.
All right, next guy. Moving forward through time, I get through the next really interesting name that comes up is in the 1880s is Henry Stimson, and he is everywhere. So let's give a quick little picture of him. There's Mr. Stimson in 1929. He's born in 1867 and died in 1950. Okay, so why is Stimson so special? Quite a few reasons. He's a Bonesman, joined the order in 1888. He marries a woman named Mabel Wellington White. Why is she important? Well, she's the great-great-granddaughter of Roger Sherman, who we just talked about, who signed all 4 of the founding documents. So keep it in the family, people. Interesting, huh?
Yeah.
So this guy is everywhere in the early 20th century. He served in the cabinet under 4 different U.S. presidents, both Democrat and Republican. He served as the Secretary of War twice, once in 1911 to 1913, and then again in 1940 to 1945.
I'm sorry, when was that?
What was happening in 1940? Yeah, exactly. We're going to go deeper into that, but if I get some more biographical details on him.
Okay.
I should just point out his deputy when he was the Secretary of War the second time was our favorite, John J. McCloy. And we are probably not going to have time to get into him too deeply today, but that name keeps popping up as well. Stimson was also famous during the war. He oversaw the Manhattan Project, and he was the guy that was pushing for the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. He also insisted on the Nuremberg trials. That was his big push. Served as Secretary of State from 1929 to 1933.
Can I say something about the Nuremberg trials?
What's that?
I want to just hit that point home about the Nuremberg trials.
Go.
The reason why he insisted on having them is because they mask what they were actually doing. So every time these evil people want to psyops us, they do something like the Nuremberg trials. So all of us rested assured for the rest of time immemorial that we had closed the book on World War II. We had Nuremberg trials. All the people were held accountable. We can move on. When in fact, the Nuremberg trials was a psyops. They took a handful of Nazis, hung them, and put a whole bunch more of them in jail. And almost overnight, while they were sentenced in some cases, either to life in prison or whatever, and a lot of them death, they commuted the sentence to life in prison. And then when Adenauer got in with his Nazi chief of intel, Reinhard Gehlen, they commuted all the sentences and they walked out of jail. The Nuremberg trials was a joke. But it was a very useful tool for these manipulators in order to be able to say they had them, because if you go back and you look at who ran the Nuremberg trials, it was a crowd from Texas. You had the judges, you had the prosecutors, they all were friends back in Texas. The entire thing was rigged.
Part of the Cowboy Network?
I'm sorry?
The Texas connection was a part of the Cowboy Network as well?
Yes. And that's how Otto Skorzeny got out of there. That's how Reinhard Gehlen got out. And that's how all of the rat lines worked and got the people down to South America. So, yeah. A Bonesman again.
We've got a lot on Stimson, so that's good right there. Interestingly enough, he also opposed the Morgenthau Plan, which we've talked about before. Morgenthau Plan was how to keep Germany from ever being able to rearm itself after World War II. So what he proposed was makes Germany sell off all its industry and basically making them nothing but farmers. That's what Morgenthau had proposed. Morgenthau's son, of course, we talked about when we were talking about BCCI, because he was it was a Morgenthau that actually got the big conviction of BCCI back in 1992, right?
Yeah.
All right. He's also U.S. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, Secretary of State from 1929 to 33, which is interesting, right when the Great Depression is happening. He would be the U.S. Attorney under Teddy Roosevelt back in the early 20th century, and he prosecuted a number of the big antitrust cases. Well, what do we know about the antitrust cases? They did not break up the trusts, is what we know. They would reemerge as a new type of entity called what we now call a U.S. corporation, which was completely designed by our favorite law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. So, interesting connection there.
Yeah. Are you going to mention his role in the Philippines?
That's my next sentence. He was the governor general. He's the governor general there from 1927 to 1929.
Yeah. Which was a very, very important period, because that's after the U.S. has taken over the Philippines and basically was doing some of their worst cruelties to the native Filipinos under his rule there. Because just so that everybody knows, when we took over places like that, you had a civilian governor general and you also had a military guy in charge. And he was the civilian governor general that oversaw the military. And so he was responsible for the heinous crimes that were committed on the Filipino people.
Well, I got more on the Philippines for you.
Okay.
So when Stimson graduates law school at Harvard, he joins a law firm called Root and Clark, very famous, prestigious firm. The name to know there is Root. His name is Elihu, Elihu, Elihu Root.
Yes, he's awful.
Well, he was Stinson's mentor. He was Secretary of the War from 1899 to 1904.
Yeah, during the Panama thing.
He's the one who framed the civilian governments of Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico, etc. This is the guy.
Yes.
He would step down from that and become Secretary of State in 1905 through 1909. And then he would become a U.S. Senator from New York until 1915. Another couple of interesting things about Root. He's the lawyer that defended Tammany Hall's boss Tweed on the corruption trials in New York.
Yep.
This is the guy who defended him and actually did a good job. And he also was a lifelong enemy of William Randolph Hearst. You remember when Hearst was what they were calling it yellow journalism? This is one of the guys that Hearst was going after the most, was Elihu Root. But that was the mentor of our friend Stimson.
His name came up a lot in the Carnegie endowment as well, which was the precursor to USAID and the funding of our interference around the world before World War II. The Carnegie endowment was for peace.
Which makes perfect sense given this guy, doing this guy's resume. That makes perfect sense. He'd be involved in that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Stimson's everywhere around World War II. We can just go into all kinds of rabbit holes on that. What I wanted to share, though, is, people have talked. We always have this conversation about whether Roosevelt knew Pearl Harbor was going to be bombed ahead of time. If Roosevelt knew, then Stimson knew. But they actually have a really, really cool piece I found, which I will share right now. So this is from April 1st, 1946, Time magazine. It's from the Pearl Harbor Committee, which was basically investigating how we let Pearl Harbor happen. They say, in its 5th month of prospecting, the Pearl Harbor Committee at last unearthed a rich find, a broad, deep vein of comment and discussion of the 1941 tragedy by ex-War Secretary Henry Stimson, studded with pure history in the form of notes from his diary. So, I'm going to read a few of these for you. November 5th. Matters are crystallizing. Japan is sending us someone who, I think, will bring a proposal impossible of acceptance. Excuse me. So he's saying Japan's going to send us an emissary, and we're just not going to like their terms. November 6th, he says, I left for the White House and had an hour's talk with the president. On the whole, a good talk. We talked about the Far Eastern situation and the approaching conference with the messenger who was coming from Japan. The president outlined what he thought he might say. He was trying to think of something which would give us further time. He suggested he might propose a truce in which there would be no movement or armament for 6 months. I told him, frankly, I saw two great objections. First, that it tied our hands at a time when it was vitally important that we should go on completing our reinforcement of the Philippines. And second, that the Chinese would feel any such arrangement was a desertion of them. Now remember his background. This is Stimson, his background with the Philippines. He's been there from day one. So obviously he's got a very interesting motives there. All right, moving on. General Marshall and I went to the White House where we were until we were.
Can I stop you for just a second? I'm sorry,
please.
I don't mean to interrupt, but to me, what you just talked about is very, very significant because he said that they're reinforcing Philippines and that to not do that would be an abandonment of China, correct?
Something along those lines, yeah.
Yeah, so you have to go back and understand what China looked like at the time. Because at the time, the British had basically infiltrated a lot of China and had been shipping Indian opium into it. You have a large presence of the Sassoons in China. You have CV Star. The AIG insurance giant started in China by CV Star. And so there is this massive, not just US, but primarily British presence in China at the time. So what he said about that is significant. Go ahead.
Very good. And this is, history in the making. In his own writing, though, they have his diary. That's what's so significant about this. And it's been public for more than, almost, 80 years now. And people still say, they argue about, whether we knew Pearl Harbor was coming or not. But
nobody talks about the real history out there, which is why we're doing what we're doing.
Very good. So November 25th, General Marshall and I went to the White House where we were until nearly 1:30. At the meeting were Hull, Knox, Marshall, Stark, and myself. Any of those names mean anything to you?
No. I mean, I know all of them, but go ahead.
Nothing about our storyline today, really.
Yeah.
The president brought up the event that we were likely to be attacked, perhaps as soon as next Monday. For the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning, and the question was what we should do. The question was how we should maneuver them into position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. Let's repeat that.
Go ahead.
The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. Any thoughts on that?
Well, how is that any different than the false flags that we have now, right? And let me add something to this. The first book that I read that made me question the whole narrative of World War II on the Pacific side was a book called At Dawn We Slept. This guy spent basically his whole life writing this book, and he didn't get it finished before he died. His grad students finished it for him. But basically what it did was it took a long period of time prior to the World War II that spent one chapter in the United States, one chapter in Japan at the same time, then US, then Japan. So you're going through a couple of decades leading up to World War II. And one of the most significant things was the reason Japan came in through the northern route that supposedly masked their presence and allowed us to be surprised was actually war gamed 10 years prior to World War II, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. 10 years before that, at a military wargaming facility in Hawaii for PACCOM, whatever you want to call it. I'm not sure exactly what the name of it was prior to World War II, but the Pacific Theater. They had war games there, both between the Army and the Navy. And for the first time, they had them for years and years and years. And no matter where they came into Hawaii, could they come in without being noticed based on the war games. 10 years prior to World War II, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, one of the guys that was doing the red, what we call red air, but red ground, whatever, red Navy, the red forces, the opposition forces, charted a course that came across the north and then down into and launched the aircraft to bomb the harbor. 10 years before it happened. And that was the one and only time in the war games that Red Air won. And so we had basically developed the plan. And then supposedly there's some leak of this plan where the Japanese knew exactly how to do it. So go ahead.
Excellent. Going back to the document. Okay. When I got back to the department, I found news from G2 that a Japanese expedition had started. 5 divisions had come down from Shantung and Shanxi to Shanghai, and there they had embarked on ships, 30, 40, or 50 ships, and have been sighted south of Formosa. Formosa is now, of course, Taiwan.
It wasn't always Taiwan?
Wasn't always called that. I at once called up Hull and told him about it and sent copies to him and the president. The main question over the message that we shall send to MacArthur on talking with the president this morning over the telephone, I suggested and he approved the idea that we should send the final alert, namely that he should be on qui vive for any attack. G2 had sent me a summary of the information in regard to the movements of the Japanese in the Far East, and it amounted to such a formidable statement of dangerous possibilities that I decided to take it to the president before he got up. He branched into an analysis of the situation himself as he sat there on his bed, saying that there were 3 alternatives, and only 3 that he could see before us. First is to do nothing. Second is to make something in the nature of an ultimatum again, stating a point beyond which we would fight, and third is to fight at once. I told him I did not think anyone would do nothing in this situation, and he agreed with me. I said of the other 2, my choice is the latter one, which means to fight at once. That's what Stimson was suggesting at the time.
And just so everyone knows, G2 is the intelligence function.
Had the OSS been formed yet?
Correct.
Okay.
No, but they're talking about the War Department. So
yeah.
They're talking about the G2 function, which is intelligence. I just wanted everybody to know that.
Very good. At a war cabinet meeting at noon, it was now the opinion of everyone that if this Japanese expedition was allowed to get around the southern point of Indochina and to go off and land in the Gulf of Siam, it would be a terrific blow of all the 3 powers, Britain at Singapore, the Netherlands, and ourselves in the Philippines.
And the Netherlands, because they have all of the Dutch East Indies, they're all through the islands. They're in Indonesia. They're everywhere there.
Yeah, I think we told the story on your show about how we got Manhattan from the Dutch for one of the Spice Islands off of not the Philippines, off of Indonesia.
Yeah.
That's how we got Manhattan, but yes. Okay, continuing. It was the consensus of everybody that this must not be allowed. Then we discussed how to prevent it. It was agreed that if the Japanese got into the Isthmus of Kra, the British would fight. It was also agreed that if the British fought, we would have to fight. If this expedition was allowed to round the southern point of Indochina, this whole chain of disastrous events would be set on foot. All right, we just got a little bit more to go, and I think it's worth doing it.
Oh, yeah, keep going. This is awesome.
Okay. It became a consensus of views that rather than strike at the forces that went by without any warning on the one hand, which we didn't think we could do, or sitting still and allowing it to go on the other, which we didn't think we could do, that the only thing for us to do was address it. The only thing to do was to address it, a warning that if it reached a certain place or a certain line or a certain point, that we should have to fight. So talking about this convoy of Japan getting too close for comfort. The president's mind evidently was running towards a special telegram from himself to the emperor. I said there ought to be a message by the president to the people of the United States, reporting that we would have to do reporting what we would have to do if danger happened. I pointed out that he had better send his letter to the emperor separate as one thing and a secret thing, and then make a speech to Congress as a separate and more understandable thing to the people of the United States. The president then asked Holland Knox and myself to draft such papers. December 2nd. The president is still deliberating the possibility of a message to the emperor, although all the rest of us are against it. But in addition to that, he is quite settled. I think that he will make a message to the Congress and will perhaps back that up with a speech to the country. He said that he was going to take the matters right up when he left us. Did any of that happen?
What do you mean?
They're saying on December 2nd that the president was going to not only send a cable to the Emperor of Japan, trying to plead him for peace or threaten him. He also needed to address Congress and then the people of the United States.
No, I don't know about the Congress, and he did send at some point a message to the emperor. I don't know about the address to Congress.
I don't believe he did, because we'll see what happens next.
Okay.
December 7th, just about 2 o'clock, while I was sitting at lunch, the president called me up on the telephone with a rather excited voice, asked me, "Have you heard the news? They've attacked Hawaii. They are now bombing Hawaii." My first feeling was of relief that the indecision was over and that a crisis had come in a way which would unite all our people. And it did. Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry, and we had
to get us into the war.
Yeah, and we had the people, the Bushes, and their business people that had been financing the Nazis industries for the last decade and a half, were pushing very hard to keep us out of World War II in Europe. They did not want war because basically their investment properties would be the ones that were bombed. FDR was fighting against them, trying to get us into war with Europe. He needed an excuse. Once Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, we declare war on Japan. Japan is allied with Germany, so Germany has to declare war on the United States. That was because we declared war on Japan, or basically Japan bombed us. But that was the excuse that FDR needed to get us into World War II, and it worked.
And do you know who was Hirohito's U.S. ambassador at the time?
I don't recall.
Okay. It's a guy by the name of Joseph Grew, Grew. And Joseph Grew, where did he go to school? Harvard. He's the ambassador at the time this happens. And what was very interesting is there's been a couple of subsequent, and I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, relatives of his that end up being the Japanese ambassador later on, that are basically in bed with this whole apparatus as well. And very interesting. This guy was the ambassador to Turkey and all kinds of other very interesting assignments leading up. And he had been in Japan. That's one of the things at Dawn We Slept that was fascinating to me. This guy had been there almost 10 years. And you're telling me you can't figure out that all the ships left and we're getting ready to fight a war? He's watching the entire country of Japan get ready for war because he's been there almost 10 years. And he knew 100%. And he communicated that information ad nauseum back to Washington, D.C. But we're not told any of that.
And interesting, we kind of knew the Japanese were going to have to come here because they were a very industrialist society, and we were cutting off their oil routes, the trades. We basically wasn't necessarily a blockade so much as we just stopped the shipping of oil. So they were oil starved.
Well, if you go back and you look at what Japan did in the lead up to this, is the British and the Netherlands, with their British East Indies and the Dutch East Indies companies, had basically began surrounding Japan, this island, like the British, who have no resources, right? So Japan had to go other places to get resources. And the story that you're fed in approved academia is that it was the Japanese, in this overt totalitarian fashion that was prior to World War II, was gobbling up all of this other territory, but they never actually talked to you about who owned the territory. It was the British and the Netherlands who had gobbled it all up first. So you have the Japanese going south, and you have the British and the Netherlands, the Dutch East Indies, coming this way, and they're going to hit a fault line. All they had to do, though, was to get America in the war in order to get the Japanese put back in place.
Very good. And we could fill up hours talking about some of the atrocities of the Japanese army of Imperial Japan, what they were doing in China and some of the other places they occupied. But that's not today's mission. So I also thought the fun part was what was going on in the 1930s between Japan and Russia. That makes for some fascinating intrigue. All right, let's finish up with Mr. Stimson. Okay. Stimson says, rereading his diary, Stimson summarized, with the aid of hindsight, I have reached the opinion that the War Plans Division of the General Staff would have placed itself in the safety of the country in a sounder position if it had transmitted to General Short more information than it did. It's a pretty powerful statement. Yet General Short had been told two essential facts. A war with Japan is threatening. Hostile action by Japan is possible at any moment. Given these two facts, both of which were stated without equivocation in the message of November 27th, the outpost commander should be on the alert to make his fight. To cluster his airplanes in such groups and positions that in an emergency they could not take the air for several hours, and to keep his anti-aircraft ammunition so stored that it could not be promptly and immediately available, and to use his best reconnaissance system, the radar, only for a small fraction of the day and night, in my opinion, betrayed a misconception of his real duty, which was almost beyond belief. So here he is throwing General Short under the bus. And the question is, should General Short have known Japan was coming? Did they give him enough warning? And what the heck was he doing with his planes clustered like that?
So there's so much there. Probably for another day, but basically you have, and this honestly is my real problem with the whole civilian leadership concept over the military. You have, and we have civilian leadership over the military with the president. That's the whole purpose of a president. But you have these other factions, obviously tainted with Skull and Bones and everything else, that on the civilian side that have the best interests of their buddies and corporate America, as opposed to what's military specific and what you need to do in order to prepare for something. So it is almost unfathomable, unless General Short was told something that was not correct, to have our military configured the way it was when it was attacked. Because that was not even a normal presence.
And I've read several times that they basically moved parts of the Navy away from Pearl Harbor. I don't know if it was just the carriers or something like that. I don't have that story down in front of me, but if you recall that, I know I've read it several times, but I'm not sure that's confirmed.
So they didn't wipe out everything. They wiped out everything that was there. And to me, the more important, and we would save this for another conversation, but to me, the more important part of this is the 30,000-foot look, because even though, because a lot of people's like, well, Japan attacked us. Why didn't we go to Japan first? Because it was never about Japan. Japan was an excuse to get us in the war. And if you go and you read that book, At Dawn We Slept, you're going to find out that there was a lot of miscommunication on purpose. So because Churchill and Roosevelt wanted us in the European war for all of the stuff that you just talked about, as far as the and again, why did we go into Africa? Lots of things. Well, they were having a lot of problems in Africa with their colonies. And so the excuse of going in and wiping out all of these Nazis that were down there actually wiped out a lot of the resistance that France and everybody else had to their colonialization at the time. So there's just so many facets to World War II that most people are not even aware of.
And you got to add in the economic side. But we were still in the Great Depression leading up to World War II. The whole world was still in the Great Depression. FDR's economic policies made things worse, not better. So from 1929 through 1939, you had maybe one or two blips where the economy stuck its nose up for air. But beyond that, it was one decade of terrible. It was a decade plus of awful economic growth. War is good for business. When you nationalize your economy, it is good.
And you have to understand that the war was used as an excuse to pass the NRA, I'm not going to remember the name of it. We ended up with the NRIA. The original bill was going to make us a socialist country under Roosevelt. And it was so infringement on capitalism and a free economic apparatus that the Supreme Court overthrew it. They threw it out. They said, no, you can't do that here. That violates the Constitution in every way. And so they came back and passed the NRIA, which was the New Deal, which was basically socialism light. Because their plan, as Anthony Sutton says, is you do the Bolshevik, you do Hitler. Well, you do Hitler, and you do Roosevelt in the middle. And those three things became the far left, far right. Roosevelt was the third way in the middle. We'll do this kind of socialism thing under the guise of, the War Act and all of this other stuff, and basically mobilize the country into a war setting that we never stopped doing. We're in that same war footing today. They actually socialized our country in support of a forever war as a result of World War II.
Yeah, and that's how they wanted to keep the military-industrial complex economic machine moving, humming.
Yes.
Had they downsized, we probably would have gone right back into depression.
I don't know that I agree with that, but obviously they wanted the theft of all of our wealth.
We talked about, Stimson is right there in all the decisions being made about World War II. That's Skull and Bones right there. You talk about the guys who founded the OSS and CIA, all the decision makings, all kinds of ties to Skull and Bones, etc. Sort of supports the thesis that these guys really are trying to create their one world government or their new world order. I neglected to mention that when Stimson was a Secretary of War from 1899 to 1904, when he was doing all this stuff in Cuba, Philippines, and Puerto Rico, do you know who his successor was as Secretary of War?
I did, but I got into GRU and my brain's blank.
That would be Skull and Bones alumni William Howard Taft.
That's right.
Yeah. So they pass it down from one Bonesman to another, the Secretary of the War. It's absolutely amazing. And nobody asked questions. All right, let's wrap up the last of Stinson's little writings. I think I got about 2 paragraphs to go.
Okay.
I have tried to review these various responsibilities with fairness both to the outpost commander and the staff officers at home. I am particularly led to do so because of the difficulty of reproducing now the background and atmosphere under which the entire Army was then working. Our general staff officers were working under terrific pressure in the face of global war, which they felt was probably imminent.
Sorry.
No worries. Yet they were surrounded outside their offices and almost throughout the country by a spirit of isolationism and disbelief in danger, which now seems incredible. There's an asterisk here where it says, the War Cabinet agreed that the U.S. must fight Japan if Japan attacked the U.S., British, or Dutch territory or moved her forces into Indochina of 100 degrees longitude or south of 10 degrees latitude. So that's pretty much this article.
And you see what you just said confirms what I was just telling you about the Dutch East Indies and the British East Indies, because they were encroaching on Japan. And the deal that the U.S. had with those two entities is if Japan attacks you as you're doing that, and as they're trying to, as you said, have enough resources for their island, that we're all basically in it together.
Excellent. Well, we went through 3 different families today, and Stimson, I thought was it's really compelling how this guy with Skull and Bones basically was at the head of the table making decisions for the United States on the verge of both World War I and World War II. Same guy, same connections. So is that opening theory correct? That maybe there's more than just maybe there's a little bit more to this connection than the gentleman who we played earlier thought.
So, and again, I go back to, if you look at the entire U.S. government, if you gave me the president, and I don't even have to have the president, if I bought the president and I put him in place, if you give me the Secretary of State and at the time the Secretary of War and maybe Commerce, you can have 5,000 government employees and I can have 3 Bonesmen and run the entire thing.
Yeah, it's those bottleneck positions.
It has nothing to do with numbers.
Yeah, well said. Let's give it a wrap today. This was good.
It was excellent.
I guess everybody want a little bit more, a few more. We'll go up to the 1890s and some of the 20th century Bonesmen next week, and there's some fun ones coming up. So we're just getting started of unpeeling this banana, or whatever metaphor you want to use. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And thanks everybody for being here. Happy New Year. We will see you in this series next Thursday. And we appreciate everybody being here. I will be back on my 4 p.m. show this afternoon. And Warhamster, what do you have coming up?
Well, let's see. I've got a couple of interesting interviews coming up. I just had Sheriff Richard Mack on Monday, and I was really pleased. I wasn't sure when I was scheduling with his wife. I go, is he going to be willing to ask some tough questions about the constitutional sheriffs. And she said, yeah, he will. And he did. We went into who's your sheriff in Florida that was almost going to be the DEA?
Oh shoot, I'm not going to remember his name.
I forget his last name, but the one Trump almost appointed the DEA. Well, it was Sheriff Mack himself that reached out to the Trump transition team and said, you do not want this guy. And his nomination lasted about a day. Well, Richard Mack did that, so props to him. He also talked about how when Van Miller was accused by Sheriff Chad Bianco in Riverside County, accused of trying to assassinate President Trump, Bianco, I've met him several times in the patriotic movement in Southern Cal. Everyone says, oh, this guy's a constitutional sheriff, and he's got great concealed carry record of. He was been really good about issuing concealed carry permits, but he also took a knee for Black Lives Matter, and he completely lied to the country about Van Miller, because if you think you don't give a press conference saying you caught the third assassin attempt, and then let the guy out on bail 5 minutes later. You do not let assassins out on bail. So that was a great interview. I highly recommend everyone go check it out. That's Sheriff Richard Mack. That's on my channel. That's the most recent video until this one gets posted. And I've got some other.
Is your channel War Hamster, Brady?
Yeah, the best place to find is on Rumble. It's just War Space Hamster or War Hamster, one word. You'll find me pretty easily. I got some other fun stuff coming up next week, and probably Mr. Constitution himself, Douglas Lee Gibbs, and I are going to finish talking about the Articles of Confederation and how they shaped the Constitution, and then we're going to jump into the Confederate Constitution, which should be a lot of fun. So,
Chad Chronister is the guy's name over in Hillsborough. That's a piece of crap. Just in case y'all don't know, he's the one that arrested Pastor Rodney Howard Brown when he was trying to feed the poor during COVID. He not only took a knee for BLM, he allowed BLM to run his county and close down entire interstates. Our sheriff, on the other hand, Grady Judd, had 3 or 4 of them come into a main intersection, and within 5 minutes, every single one of them had been grabbed by the nape of their neck and drugged out of that intersection. And there was not another incident of Antifa or BLM anywhere. So, yeah.
Amazing how that works.
Amazing how that works. So also, I just want to plug for anybody here for the first time that on the 9th of January at 4 p.m. on this channel on Rumble, the Colonel's Corner, we will have Paul Williams, the man that started this entire Operation Gladio phenomenon for me. And I'm very excited about having him on the show. So
yeah, that should be great. I will be watching that.
Yeah.
I've actually got it on my calendar already.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next Tuesday for a continuation of our Secret Societies series. Thanks for being here. Cheers and Happy New Year.